This is a Yak-23, a Soviet-built jet fighter. Designed in the late 1940s, it was supplied in large numbers to the Soviet satellite countries. But this one, seen here, is being flown by an American, and despite its distinct profile, it is disguised as an American aircraft. The year is 1953. The story is true and the circumstances fantastic. Under covert operations, this Soviet Yak-23 was taken from communist Eastern Europe, flight tested on American soil, and returned to the rightful owners without their ever learning of its absence. The top-secret examination was conducted at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. Security guards maintained a 24-hour vigil outside the restricted area, while a handful of specialists worked to uncover all the Yak-23's secrets. The entire aircraft was assembled piece by piece, and when flight tests were completed, it was then disassembled and packed up just as it had been received. Any discrepancy in positioning the pieces would surely jeopardize the operation and put certain lives in danger. Prior to this evaluation, American intelligence had considered the Yak-23 a poor combat fighter, a far cry from its contemporary, the Soviet MiG-15. This jet fighter had proven a deadly opponent in the Korean War. Among American pilots, it had generated an aura of fear and mystique. But when a North Korean defector flew a MiG-15 to a U.S. air base in South Korea, American intelligence officers were able to dispel the myths. The U.S. Air Force quickly learned what the MiG-15 could and could not do. That was in September of 1953, just weeks before the United States would sneak the Yak-23 out of Eastern Europe. Why would the Air Force take such risks to evaluate a second-rate fighter like the Yak-23, and only weeks after it had learned everything there was to know about the best fighter the Soviets had to offer? The top-secret evaluation of the Yak-23 is surrounded by many questions, some of which still remain unanswered. Only recently has this story been open to the public. Few individuals will discuss it, and many are still unaware of what actually happened in this hangar years ago. This is a C-124 Globemaster, the large transport aircraft which flew the Yak-23 out of Eastern Europe. The name of the country from which it was taken is still considered classified information and continues to remain a secret. The story begins within this mystery. In mid-October of 1953, two intelligence officers of a communist Balkan country approached the U.S. Embassy in that country. In their hands, they carried information that could easily strain the tense East-West relations of the Cold War. What they had to offer would surely involve security risks for America. For their country, however, the risks were far greater. Discovery of their plan would cause an international incident and could mean certain death for fellow countrymen, including themselves. A meeting was hastily scheduled between these foreign intelligence officers and the CIA station chief, to whom they made a most intriguing proposition. They claimed that a Soviet Yak-23 being transshipped by railroad through their country to another communist Balkan country was in their hands. The aircraft was packed in a crate. Would the Americans, it was asked, like to take it to the U.S., flight test it, and then return it in the crate exactly as they had found it? Success of the operation rested on this most crucial point. The Americans must leave no trace that the Yak-23 ever left its crate. The Americans accepted the offer, and with the approval of the Air Force, it was decided that the aircraft would be loaded onto a C-124 and flown out of Europe. The secret cargo would be accompanied by 3 foreign escorts, a high-ranking officer and 2 aeronautical engineers. The destination? Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where the full capabilities of the Air Technical Intelligence Center could be utilized. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base is located in Dayton, Ohio. This C-141 transport plane is approaching the same airstrip on which the C-124 landed with the Soviet Yak 43 years ago. Back then, however, the Yak-23 arrived in total darkness. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the C-124 was towed to the open doors of this building, Hangar 145. Here, the crate was unloaded, and inside, the Yak was carefully assembled under tightly guarded conditions. Only a select group of men from the Air Technical Intelligence Center was given access. Vic Billick was one of those analysts. He is also one of the few men who will talk about that secret operation.
It was a unique opportunity. We had never had one, to my knowledge, as an analyst rather than as a collector, that we didn't have a parallel situation. We're in a foreign Air Force would offer us the opportunity to look at the airplane, and here we had it delivered clear to the United States, right to the heart of our own research capability, and an opportunity to exploit it with all our instrumentation and measurement equipment right here, as opposed to improvising at a European base.
The aircraft was assembled and operated from a specially boarded-off corner of Hangar 145. The few who were given access had to reestablish their right to be in the area each time they entered. Foreign markings were removed from the Yak-23 and replaced by standard U.S. Air Force insignia. To complete the disguise, the aircraft was given the same serial number as that of the chase plane used in flight tests. The test pilot chosen was Captain H.E. Tom Collins. Collins was one of the 3 pilots who had tested the MiG-15 in Okinawa the previous month. For his ground crew, he chose experienced mechanics from past test projects, including Ray Gardner, who had worked with him on the MiG-15. Initial inspection revealed a serious problem with the main landing gear tires. They were so badly worn that it was unlikely Collins could make more than one takeoff and landing without a blowout. AirTech Intelligence made an immediate call to the Goodyear Tire Company and requested an overnight delivery of 2 new tires. Later, an executive of Goodyear called back. "We would love to take your money for making special tires overnight," he explained. "But the ones you described are already made by us for the F-94B." Bolstered by this stroke of good luck, Collins' team took a new set of tires from stock and promptly installed them. The cockpit of the Yak-23 was considered small compared to most American fighters. The pilot sat at the wing's trailing edge. Sideways vision was thus limited by the wing surface. In fact, the whole field of vision was considered to be only average. From the American standpoint, the Yak-23 was not a remarkable aircraft. Indeed, it was a simple aircraft. But its simplicity made it easy to fly, and this had made it popular among pilots in Russia and Eastern Europe. Although production had stopped in 1950, the Yak-23 still served largely in the Soviet satellite countries. In the event of hostilities, air forces of the Western Bloc nations would undoubtedly lock combat with them. During the Cold War, no Russian aircraft, no matter how mediocre, was to be taken lightly by the Western Bloc air forces.
How's your recognition of Russian aircraft? Take this one, for instance. Do you know what it is? Yes, you're quite right. It's the Yak-23, now known as Flora. I personally can't understand why they've given a jolly good Scottish name to what might be described as not a very outstanding Russian aircraft. However, as you can see,
this training film was produced to highlight the Yak-23's defining characteristics, one of which deserves special mention.
an interesting point is that Flora uses the Soviet production version of the Rolls Royce turbojet that was originally sold to them in 1947. The armament consists of...
How the Yak-23 got its engine warrants a closer look at Russia's early quest for a superior jet fighter.
Fitted in the air.
In 1947, the British government supplied the Soviet Union with 25 Rolls-Royce Nene and 30 Rolls-Royce Derwent turbojet engines. At the time, they offered greater power and better reliability than the engines being developed in the Soviet Union. When they arrived in Russia, they were copied, and the derivatives were built as the Soviet RD-500 and the RD-45. Perhaps foresight had not lent itself to the British suppliers at the time, for here was a clear paradox. Western technology had boosted Soviet aircraft development. Because of the Rolls-Royce design, Russian engineers could build the jet engines that were needed to power the next generation of Soviet fighters. In particular, the RD-45 would secure the future of an advanced but as yet underpowered prototype fighter, what was to become the legendary MiG-15. The design bureau which created the MiG-15, Mikoyan-Gurevich, was an old rival of the Yakovlev Bureau, creator of the Yak-23. In jet fighter design, however, there was no contest. The MiG-15's RD-45 engine was mounted inside a tubular fuselage. The jet exhaust nozzle was at the rear of the tube so that hot exhaust gases would not come into contact with any part of the fuselage. By contrast, the Yak-23 appeared to have been designed with no real concern for aerodynamically clean lines. Its engine was the equally powerful RD-500, with a long, deep, blunt nose made for a heavy forward section, accentuated by the marked step of the jet exhaust opening. More importantly, the Yak-23, with its straight wing, could not achieve the speed and performance level of the MiG-15's advanced swept wing design. When the MiG-15 made its debut in 1948, it demonstrated superb acceleration and climb capabilities. The Soviet version of the Rolls-Royce engine pushed it to speeds of over 600 miles per hour. High-speed performance in the air had been an obsession with Joseph Stalin. In the race to build a superior jet fighter, the MiG Design Bureau had clearly delivered him a champion, and in so doing pushed its Yak rival out of the running. During World War II, however, the situation had been quite the reverse. It was the Yakovlev Design Bureau that proved to be the maker of champions for Stalin's Air Force. In fact, the Yak fighter designs of World War II far outclassed those of the MiG Bureau. Alexander Yakovlev had been a rising star among Soviet aircraft designers, and in 1938, Joseph Stalin asked him to build a general-purpose tactical fighter with a combat capability far superior to that of anything currently in the Red Air Force. Yakovlev, who had never built a fighter plane before, promised a prototype within the year. On June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa and penetrated Russia's western front with devastating results. In the first months of the invasion, the Red Air Force lost nearly 70% of its numbers. Despite the staggering losses, however, the new generation of fighter aircraft led by the Yakovlev Design Bureau, would soon replenish the frontline fighter regiments. The Yak-1 was underpowered and underarmed against the superior aircraft of Hitler's Luftwaffe, but the later Yak-3 proved a good match for the German Messerschmitts. Once the Russian pilots overcame their deep-seated fear of the Luftwaffe, they soon perfected their combat abilities. The high-performance Yak-3 offered its pilot an agility unknown to any previous Soviet fighter. As for the fighters designed by the Mikoyan-Gurevich Bureau, they were inferior to the Yak's handling capabilities. The MiG-1 and MiG-3 could fly well at high altitudes, but they failed to meet the requirements of low aerial warfare over Russia. The most important aircraft designed by Yakovlev during the war was the Yak-9. Whereas the Yak-1 and the Yak-3 were high-performance aircraft, the Yak-9 became the consummate battlefield fighter. It was heavier, it had greater endurance, and it evolved into a multi-purpose combat aircraft. It was not long before the quality and quantity of Yak fighters finally broke the back of the Luftwaffe. In the final months of the war, however, the Yak Design Bureau would face an entirely different challenge. Pure jet power. Germany revealed the future of combat aircraft design with the introduction of its Me-262. It came too late to change the course of the war, but it did change the face of aerial combat. Working from captured German documents, the Soviets had already begun developing their own jet designs. It was Alexander Yakovlev's belief that this new breed of engine should be integrated into proven aircraft types. Instead of designing an entirely new aircraft, components of a Yak-3 were adapted to accommodate the jet propulsion system. He expanded the forward fuselage, locating the engine underneath. The tail was strengthened to withstand the hot exhaust from the jet nozzle below the midsection. The prototype, designated the Yak-15, flew in April 1946. But the distinction of being the first Russian jet to fly had gone just 3 hours earlier to the MiG-9, the latest from the Mikoyan-Gurevich Bureau. Once the piston engine had given way to the turbojet, Yak fighters no longer held their advantage over MiG designs. In August of that year, the Russian public got its first glimpse of jet aircraft at the aviation parade at Tushino. By then, it had become quite clear to the United States that Joseph Stalin, a one-time ally, was the new adversary in a new kind of war, the Cold War. No one was more concerned, therefore, with the advance of Soviet jet technology than the Americans. Air Technical Intelligence of the U.S. Air Force was an analytic organization created during World War II that had focused on evaluating German aircraft equipment. And most of the information that had been captured from German laboratories was used in the development of post-war aircraft. After the war, however, intelligence gathering was redirected toward the Soviet Union. But little information on Soviet technology was available.
While the Soviets made many advancements in their own Air Force during World War II, introduced a lot of new aircraft as we did, we were not focused on doing an intelligence job against our ally, and we really didn't make much a point of gathering the technical information. And whereas the Germans, of course, did so. They were very concerned with the development in the Soviet Union, and so they created a large tech intelligence base.
The Yak-15 and its successor, the Yak-17, were essentially World War II aircraft, despite their jet engines. The MiG-9, although it was designed for jet power, was still crude, and the engines themselves were copies of German World War II technology. With access to German wartime data on Soviet technology, air tech intelligence could make reasonably accurate estimates of early post-war Soviet capabilities. But this was hardly reassuring. It would not be long before the Soviets were building jet aircraft of their own design. And as the Cold War took shape by the late 1940s, the fear of a military confrontation was all too real.
We were real concerned about the Soviet advancements in jet aircraft and radars and other equipment advancements, communications and so forth, command and control, that would make them in an adversarial situation. We wanted to know what our bombers would encounter in the way of being intercepted by the Soviet defensive forces, and also what kind of an offensive air capability the Soviets had should at any time it happened to be that the Soviets would try to bomb the United States.
The Soviet Union in 1950 had no intention of engaging in a direct military confrontation with the United States. Instead, the ideological battle between the two world powers would be fought indirectly through client states around the world. When North Korean troops invaded South Korea in June 1950, the United States, determined to turn back the communist aggressors, entered a war that would escalate into a major conflict. The Soviet Union never officially entered the war, but the United States and its allies would feel its sting in a more indirect way. American pilots flying B-29 bombers over North Korea were stunned to see their aircraft being destroyed by cannon fire from short, swept-wing jet fighters bearing North Korean colors. But these were Soviet-made aircraft. The MiG-15 had arrived. These new Soviet fighters were far superior to anything else in the skies above North Korea. The Americans had only one fighter in the same class, the North American F-86 Sabre. But none were stationed in South Korea, and they were promptly sent from the United States to counter the MiG-15 threat. Both fighters were well matched, and air-to-air combat was fierce. While the battle for air supremacy raged between the American and Soviet-designed fighters, air tech intelligence did the best it could to separate fact from fiction over the MiG-15. There were estimates based on earlier Soviet developments, and there were detailed descriptions made by F-86 pilots who fought them in the sky. But analysts desperately wanted to examine a fully operational MiG-15 up close. In September of 1953, they got their chance. Under Operation Moolah, U.S. planes had dropped thousands of pamphlets over North Korea offering $100,000 to any pilot who would fly his MiG-15 into South Korea and turn it over to the Americans. Lieutenant No Kun-suk, defected from North Korea, delivered his MiG-15 and accepted the reward. The Korean War had ended just months before, but the opportunity to fully examine the Soviets' most advanced fighter was an intelligence coup nonetheless. The plane was taken to Okinawa, where an expert team from the Air Technical Intelligence Center arrived from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to conduct the evaluation. Among the three test pilots were Colonel Al Boyd, Major Chuck Yeager, famous for being the first pilot to exceed the speed of sound, and Captain Tom Collins, who would test the Yak-23 just 4 weeks later back at Wright-Patterson. Collins was the first to fly the Soviet fighter. All the MiG-15's flight performance capabilities were explored. Comparisons to the F-86 were made. All the equipment was disassembled and examined. The guns were fired in controlled tests. And when the evaluation was completed, the analysts from Airtech Intelligence were delighted to learn that all the findings matched their original estimates exactly. But naturally, nothing was publicized. The accuracy of their findings would remain a secret for years, lest the Soviets learn how good the investigative techniques of Airtech Intelligence truly were. The next month, the Yak-23 arrived for secret testing at Wright-Patterson in Ohio. It would seem there was little to gain from testing this second-rate fighter, especially after the MiG-15 evaluation, but this was not the case.
To get another jet was just another real milestone, and it turned out that the Yak-23 was a insurance development by the Soviets. They were a little skeptical of the swept wing design of the MiG-15 in development, so they carried on a parallel development of a more conservative airplane with the Yak. But there were some other design features in the Yak that gave us some good milestones on their state of the art and technology and what their potential for future developments would be.
Keeping the operation a secret from base personnel was difficult. Hangar 145 was located in a rather active area. But the greatest security risk lay in the assembly and disassembly of the aircraft. When the crate had been first opened, a photographer recorded the position of each aircraft piece before it was removed. It was a matter of life and death to those who had loaned the aircraft that nothing faced the wrong way when the pieces were later replaced. This made an already tedious job that much harder for the mechanics. Before assembly, each piece was closely inspected by a specialist, and in most cases, taken to the respective lab for testing. Every bit of data was considered valuable, no matter how insignificant it might seem compared to the findings of the MiG-15 evaluation.
You know, you can't do projections too well from a single point of reference. You have to have a broader base, this gave us a very sound base to make additional projections on the design capabilities in such things as the oxygen system, the controls, the instrumentation aboard the airplane, radio equipment and all. A lot of these were not identical to the ones in the MiG, and so, as I say, it gave us another point of reference.
Like the MiG-15, the Yak-23 was powered by a Soviet copy of the British Rolls Royce turbojet engine. It was the only aircraft using the RD-500, which was practically identical to the Rolls Royce Derwent 5. Several engine parts were checked for interchangeability with the Derwent. The combustion chamber liners were 100% interchangeable. The Soviet copywork was excellent, with the only significant difference being a relocated oil tank. Instrumentation in the cockpit was relabeled for pilot identification. For the MiG-15 tests, Captain Collins had used a North Korean pilot for help in translation. Here, he had only the help of a Russian interpreter, and several switches had to be labeled unknown. The Mach meter, airspeed indicator, and altimeter were replaced by U.S. flight test counterparts. Since the Yak-23 had no cockpit pressurization, mechanics installed an American oxygen system with a reservoir tank. The bad experiences with the faulty Soviet oxygen system in the MiG-15 had prompted Collins to ask for the replacement. As no new holes could be drilled, installation was especially challenging. The Yak-23 was armed with two 23mm NR-type guns, N for Noodleman, R for Richter. This was a slight variant from the NS, Noodleman-Surinov guns that were found in the MiG-15. At the controlled tests in Okinawa, analysts found the MiG's NS guns to be lightweight, small, and possessing a high rate of fire. As gunnery expert, Vic Billick needed to know what performance differences from the MiG's gun existed in the NR type of the Yak.
The availability of the Yak-23 gave us an opportunity to get not only a complete gun, but in perfect condition, such that we were able to carefully study its design. We had ammunition from Korea, and we fired the gun, and actually at one point we put the gun in a cold chamber and took it down to around 50 degrees below zero, and there was a great accumulation of block ice on the working parts of the gun, and we then fired it, and it immediately responded and fired well with the severe freezing condition. We were not surprised because we got the same results when we had tested that type of gun, the Noodleman designs, out of the MiG-15s.
When the aircraft was ready for flight tests, security precautions were intensified. Maintaining secrecy inside the hangar was one thing. Outside, however, would be an entirely different affair. For its initial start, the Yak was towed to a thrust stand area. All tests outside were to be done at daybreak when the flight line was deserted. Flights would be flown from a taxiway turnoff at Patterson Field near the woods to limit exposure of the aircraft as much as possible. The engine would not start on the first try. An examination of the engine supported by available intelligence data revealed that the torch igniter fuel pump was faulty. Because of the interchangeability of parts between the RD-500 and the Derwent-5 engines, a pump from the British engine allowed the tests to continue. When the next start was a success, Collins took the Yak out for its first taxi tests. The taxiway that had been chosen for flight operation lent little room for maneuvering on these initial runs. It was thus decided to use the wide taxi apron of runway 23, just northeast of the alert hangars, even though there was a security risk of being spotted. This decision would prove fateful. At the takeoff end of runway 23, Collins had just taken the Yak into the hold area when 4 F-86 Sabre jets from the 97 Fighter Interceptor Squadron came out of the alert hangars on an active air scramble. The F-86 pilots taxied so close to Collins that he could see them staring at the unfamiliar Yak. Collins was sure their security had been blown.
We all got very anxious when we realized that this group went by so close and that they could identify the airplane, and that maybe one of them that might have been acutely aware of the configuration of foreign aircraft would have said, hey, that's a Soviet aircraft.
Even if the pilots could not identify the Yak-23, they had probably recognized Collins sitting in the open cockpit. He was certain some of the pilots knew him, and they were bound to be curious. Fortunately, Collins was prepared for just such an incident. He had already worked out a cover story in the back of his mind and decided to use it should one of the pilots become inquisitive. The Yak-23 vaguely resembled the Bell X-5, an experimental test plane that had been flying in Muroc, California. In October 1953, just weeks before the Yak's arrival, one of the two X-5s had crashed during a test flight. There was much publicity, and Collins decided to build his cover story around this event. If anyone asked about the Yak-23, Collins would explain that it was the other X-5 and was doing some highly classified testing at Wright-Patterson. As expected, Collins received a call from one of the F-86 pilots who asked about the peculiar plane he had seen during the air scramble. Collins laid out the whole X-5 story.
And that was enough for him. They said, well, can we see that? And he said, no, there's so much security on it, we can't. But they would accept it, American security. R&D project on the field were often under a very tight cover, limited access, so that only a few people could get to a particular new design aircraft. So that was not unusual at all, and they accepted it. But we were very worried that it was blown, that there was this was a Soviet aircraft on right field. Didn't happen.
The X-5 story was simple, plausible, and it worked every time they had to use it. Security precautions were still rigidly maintained, however. All exterior testing was restricted to the early daylight hours, but overall testing continued around the clock. While mechanics conducted thrust tests, other analysts examined equipment not being used for engine evaluation. Different groups had access at different times, and the hours were long and hard. Often, when a shift ended, the work was far from over, but this part of the job could hardly be called work. Apart from the aircraft, there were the 3 foreign nationals who had escorted the Yak from their country in the Balkans. Because their presence on the base was kept a secret, they had to maintain a low profile. It was up to Vic Billick and his cronies to socialize with the 3 visitors.
We were encouraged to get with them, to keep them happy, as a matter of speaking. And so we would go over to their quarters during break periods. They were quartered in some temporary housing available not too far away from the Tech Intelligence Center. And we would sit there and talk to them as best as we could with using everything from German to sign language, and they spoke a little English. At least one of them, I remember, spoke a little English, and we were able to get along quite well. With a name like Billick, you can detect that I have my dad was a Czech. I have a root to the total Slavic base, and that made myself a little more friendly to them. They took to it. They wanted to know where my dad came from and all this sort of thing. And as I mentioned, my father came from Czechoslovakia, and so I might have had a little advantage in becoming friendly with them. But one of the other things, of course, was a measure of if you would share drinking their liquor with them, it also made a good friendship. They had some liquid refreshment with them that they really liked, and it was a very, very powerful beverage along the lines of aquavit and I guess a vodka type drink. So I happened to be able to drink along with them and enjoy the evening and a few hours. So as a result of it, after they went home, one of them sent me a bottle of this as a token of his appreciation of the way we got along. And I kept it all these 40 years, and that's a little bit of memorabilia about the fact that it was not all work. They were nice guys.
This was a fellowship that had transcended the Iron Curtain. A camaraderie that had put a slight thaw for a moment in the icy conditions of the Cold War. It was indeed a warm reflection of the cooperation these three foreign nationals had offered to the analysis of the Yak-23.
They showed just do anything at all to give us information in regards to their experience in handling jet aircraft. And now I can't remember whether they were pilots, but they talked about their country's experience with jet airplanes, and they were certainly very cooperative.
Who were these three who had escorted the Yak-23 to the U.S.? To this day, their identity is still classified information, as is the name of the country from which they came. The official account states only that the Yak-23 was loaned to the United States by a communist Balkan country. The Balkans are a group of nations in the southeast of Europe. In 1953, there were 4 communist Balkan countries: Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and Albania. Soon after the end of World War II, each had fallen under the Soviet sphere of influence. But in 1948, one of these Balkans broke from the Soviet bloc. Yugoslavia, while it remained fiercely communist, became the first socialist state to challenge Joseph Stalin and get away with it. The independent Yugoslavia was ruled by the indomitable Joseph Tito. Tito had been neither anti-Russian nor even anti-Stalin, but unlike his communist neighbors, he did insist on being master of his own house. Tito had been largely responsible for liberating his country from Nazi Germany. For that, support among his countrymen was unshakable. He enjoyed fierce loyalty among party leaders, and more importantly, he firmly controlled the army and secret police. By 1953, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania were virtually under the direction of Soviet authority. Romania and Bulgaria were strongly anti-Tito, and the term Titoism had been applied to any socialist state that dared defy Soviet control. But only Tito's Yugoslavia succeeded in remaining outside the Soviet sphere of influence. Was it Yugoslavia which loaned the Yak-23 to the United States? It does appear the likely candidate. Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania were all supplied with Yak-23s. Yugoslavia was not. At the American embassy, the CIA chief had been told that the Yak was being transshipped to another communist Balkan country by railroad. If the Yak-23 was on its way, for instance, to Albania from either Romania or Bulgaria, it would have to pass through the mountainous terrain of Yugoslavia. The reverse is true as well. Judging from his relationship with Moscow, Tito seems the most likely to have offered the U.S. a first-hand look at a Soviet-built aircraft. Despite the facts, however, this is all speculation. Whether or not these foreign escorts were Yugoslavian cannot be verified. After over 40 years, their identity and nationality continues to remain a secret. If they are still alive today, perhaps U.S. authorities feel that revealing their identity could put them in harm's way. In any case, their contribution to air tech intelligence will not be forgotten. The Yak-23 was ready for its first flight test on November 4, 1953. The aircraft was small, with a gross weight of only 6,600 pounds, nearly 5,000 less than the MiG-15. Yakovlev had designed the aircraft to be smaller, lighter, and faster than the Yak-17. It was, but the Yak-23 was far from being an efficient jet fighter. Equipped with high-frequency radio instruments, the Yak could send high-frequency signals to this radio truck. The signals would then be rebroadcast in standard Air Force band for analysis. At takeoff, once the brakes were released, acceleration was very rapid. The Yak-23 quickly outpaced the F-86 chase plane. Because acceleration was so rapid, Collins had to retrim the aircraft immediately after takeoff. The climb qualities were exceptional. The Yak-23 had excellent turn ability and good stalling characteristics. But in probing its limits, Collins found problems unacceptable for a modern jet fighter. There were no speed brakes, and deceleration from critical Mach speed of 0.8 was extremely difficult. At this speed, aileron buzz was so severe that the wingtips fluttered up and down between 8 and 12 inches. Collins remarked that each time he flew at Mach 0.8, he felt like the wings were going to rip off. With no cockpit pressurization, Collins would have to wear a self-contained pressure suit to take the Yak to its absolute ceiling of 52,000 feet. But there was a problem. The Yak-23 pilot's seat was designed for a seat-type parachute. With the pressure suit fully inflated, Collins' head would be forced against the canopy and cocked to one side. It was an unacceptable situation. Instead, Collins decided to fly without a parachute. He would later remark that it felt a little strange.
Yes, I'll say 2 dollars. Keep 3 left.
8 test flights were flown in all, the last being on November 25th. Collins concluded that despite the problems with directional stability and the limitations to high-altitude flying, the Yak-23 was a competent aircraft, and it could be expected to defend itself against contemporary jet fighters. By 1953, the Soviet Air Force had already replaced its Yak-23 fighter regiments with the superior MiG-15. The last Yak-23s would be withdrawn from the Soviet satellite countries in 1961. Air Tech Intelligence had gleaned all it could from the Yak-23 evaluation, and in most cases found little that strayed from original estimates. The obstacles had been great and the risks high, but intelligence gathering is an all-or-nothing exercise. No facts can be overlooked, no opportunity missed. After the final test flight, the Yak was put back in its crate precisely as it had been found. The C-124 picked it up and returned it and the 3 escorts to the Balkan country from which they'd come. Not a trace had been left. The secret evaluation of the Yak-23 would remain in the black until 1991. The test film that has been shown here was downgraded to unclassified status in 1975, after sections that named the country of origin were removed. Hangar 145 is still being used. High-speed jet transports line the walls now. This story is now finally being told outside the intelligence community. And yet most who use this hangar today still know nothing of the small Soviet jet that was hidden here over 40 years ago.
In 1951, a Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-15 is shot down over Korea's west coast and plummets into the Yellow Sea. The jet is pulled from the shallow water by US and South Korean forces, transported by a British frigate for study. At a US Air Force base in Dayton, Ohio, the plane is pored over. One of the first discoveries of this incredible aircraft comes when the engine is inspected. Expecting to find a hybrid of Russian and German jet technology, the team studying the captured prize receive a shock. The plane is powered by what appears to be a Rolls Royce Nene 2, designed in England. 1940. Since the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Germany and the Soviet Union have been in an alliance, using their combined might to carve up Eastern Europe. With France giving in quickly to the Nazis, England's newly appointed Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, knows that German troops will soon be clambering up the English beachfront. He decides to send a new ambassador to Moscow, and a member of Parliament volunteers for the job. He is Richard Stafford Cripps. Born into privilege, Cripps' first love is chemistry, and following a stint as an ambulance driver during the Great War, he studies law and becomes a successful attorney, before an interest in politics lures him to run for office. Cripps joins the Labour Party, and in 1930 becomes Solicitor General in Ramsay MacDonald's government, a position that includes the honour of becoming a knight. Though regarded by all as a brilliant man, Sir Stafford Cripps has a tendency to ruffle feathers, and soon finds himself clashing with Labour over his political leanings. Some of his views are considered so extremely left-wing by the Labour Party that he's chased out. Now sitting as an independent, he finds himself on a trip to Moscow, with a goal of aligning the Soviet Union with Britain.
Stafford Cripps was certainly born into a life of privilege, and his father was a Conservative MP. This no doubt stimulated his own interest in politics. But what I think really led him into his own particular line in politics was really his religion. We can't understand Stafford Cripps unless we understand that he was a committed Christian who had very fervent beliefs. In some ways they seem rather naive. They're certainly idealistic. He believed in the brotherhood of man. The crucial event for him was really the economic crisis of 1931, when Britain was hit by the so-called economic blizzard that swept away the Labour government and seemed to indicate that the capitalist system simply wasn't coping and couldn't cope. This led Cripps from being a moderate member of the Labour Party into adopting Marxism, which naturally involved a degree of sympathy with the Soviet Union.
In 1940, while the Battle of Britain rages, Cripps arrives in Moscow. While hope is high that he can steer Russia into an alliance with England, early results are not at all promising. Just days after Cripps has a 3-hour meeting with Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Premier and Foreign Commissar Vyacheslav Molotov gives a speech on how successful the Russian-German alliance has been for the country. Cripps continually warns Stalin not to trust Hitler, but to no avail.
The key episode was really from 1940 to 1941, when he went to Russia as Britain's ambassador. And what he found there certainly changed his view and formed what to many people will seem a surprisingly unfavourable view of Soviet Russia for such a left-wing figure.
From his book, The Cripps Version, Dr. Peter Clark reads Cripps' correspondence with his daughter during the politician's time as ambassador in Russia.
He's talking about the regime and says that it has many difficulties, perhaps due partly because they're inherent in every form of dictatorship. And he continues in this way: if to all these difficulties you add the government by secret police and spies, which is the only method for a dictatorship, then in such a country as this, with a people of this kind apt to intrigue and brought up in underground revolutionary activities, you get perpetual change of personnel and liquidation of many of the more intelligent people, creating new difficulties of organisation. In the passage I just quoted, we see already, surely, that Cripps accepts that this is essentially a dictatorship, it is essentially a police state, that it is in many ways a deeply unattractive society. During the war, admittedly, he argued very strongly in favour of alliance with Russia as the best way to beat Hitler's Germany. But long before the end of the war, he was certainly no ideological captive of the communist system.
Within a year, Cripps' warnings about Hitler's trustworthiness become all too real, and Stalin must face the awful truth. Operation Barbarossa begins as Nazi Germany storms into Soviet-controlled territory and pushes Stalin's forces back. It's a swift, fiery onslaught that knocks the Red Army back on its heels. It's a turn of events which suits Winston Churchill just fine. Not only does this new Eastern Front relieve some of the pressure on his troops, but it gives him, and particularly Cripps, clout with Stalin and amongst the Russians. A bond is forged over their common enemy, and soon an Anglo-Russian alliance is formed. But Churchill may be on shaky ground at home. Not only do the Russian politicians embrace Cripps, but the British public do as well. After a broadcast to the nation on the situation in Russia, Cripps is suddenly one of the most popular men in the nation, even seen as a contender for the position of Prime Minister. At a time when defeats are plentiful, Cripps makes it known that he'd be ready to take up the post if Churchill is unable to manage. Churchill seizes on this. In March of 1942, he sends his new rival to India in order to broker a deal with Gandhi and Jinnah. If the Cripps mission is a success, India will aid the war effort against the Nazis in exchange for self-rule once the conflict is at an end. But the mixed messages Cripps seems to be giving to the Indian negotiators during the trip causes it to end with no deal in place. The Indian Congress Party will not agree to aid England in the war. But aid is coming from another source. Through its Lend-Lease program, the United States of America begins to send supplies to the Allied forces in exchange for gold. They supply vast numbers of vehicles throughout the war, and Britain is the main beneficiary of the deal. The Soviet Union is far behind the West in technological advances, and needs aid as well. Russia receives close to 15,000 aircraft by the war's end, almost 20% of all the aircraft that they use. The most prominent of these is the Bell P-39 Airacobra. It's best suited for low-altitude flight due to its lack of turbo superchargers. Its unconventional layout, with the engine behind the pilot, leaves little room for storing fuel. The standard load is carried in the P-39's wings. It's therefore limited to short-range tactical strikes. The most advanced fighters and bombers the Americans keep for themselves. It aggravates the Soviets to be given the older technology, but they make do with what they're given. Of the equipment delivered, much of it is not suited to combat on the Eastern Front. Aircraft meant for tropical conditions are now used in a much colder climate. There are few spare parts, and so crews must sometimes improvise as best they can. The Soviets learn to adapt the Western technology to their needs and uses, skills that will serve them well in the years to come. 1945. First, Nazi Germany falls, and then so does Winston Churchill. The general election on July the 5th knocks the Conservatives from power and brings in a new Labour government, led by the wartime coalition government's Deputy Prime Minister, Clement Attlee. The public feels that the Labour Party will be more adept at helping England rebuild in the post-war period. Joining Attlee's cabinet as Minister of the Board of Trade is Sir Stafford Cripps.
The election of a Labour government in 1945 came as a great surprise to the world, who imagined that Winston Churchill would inevitably win re-election, having won the war. I think it's important to realise the strong elements of continuity, especially in foreign policy, that went over from Churchill's coalition wartime government, in which Labour had played a big part, into the post-war Labour government.
The main thrust of this new government is to rebuild the war-weathered country. It's about winning the peace by giving Britons a crutch to lean on. They use the 1942 Beveridge Report as a guide for reforming the country. Attlee brings about sweeping changes that will alter the country for decades to come. Free national health care, education for everyone up to the age of 15, social security. He works towards giving India and Burma their freedom. It's far removed from the direction that their ally America is heading. More and more nations adopt communism, and never comfortable with these ideals, America finds these new social developments within Britain curious and worrisome. Churchill was the sort of man Americans understood, and Attlee is no Churchill. He's small and modest, spares his words when they aren't needed. To Americans, the contrast is a sharp one that gives them pause. Labour's domestic policies seem much closer to communism than to capitalism.
Foreign policy was largely in the hands of the Prime Minister Clement Attlee and the very strong Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin. Now, both of them, in 1945 and 1946, were ready to take a much stronger line against the Soviet Union and its threat to the integrity of states in Eastern Europe than the Americans were at the time. So Attlee and Bevin had to argue with President Truman about the need to stand up to Soviet Russia. It wasn't really until events took their own course during 1946 that, in a sense, Truman came round to the rather harder line that the British government was already following. It's therefore somewhat surprising to find that in popular politics in the United States, Britain, simply because it had a Labour government, was then perceived as a weak link in the Western alliance. If you come down to the realities of the situation, you see that it's in fact British policy that is actually more consistent through the 1940s in taking a firm line in opposing Soviet expansionism. And Cripps, for all his previous sympathy with the Soviet Union, is firmly in support of the line of the government of which he's a leading member.
America's astounding capacity for production kept Britain well supplied during its darkest days following the Battle of Britain and supplemented their renewed manufacturing throughout the rest of the war. And now, very suddenly, the Lend-Lease program, that boon to Allied nations throughout the war, ends. America turns off the tap and stops the flow of resources into Britain. Not only that, they send the bill. Over £1 billion to be paid back over a 50-year period. As America is entering a post-war boom in prosperity, Britain is withering under its immense debt and damaged infrastructure. 750,000 homes damaged or destroyed. 1/3 of gold reserves spent. Food rationing becomes more stringent than it had been during the war. Coal, an absolute necessity for providing Britain with heat and manufacturing, is scarce.
We shall only get it right if we can produce much more than we did before the war. That's the only way we can get the things we need. Food, clothes, entertainment, a little less struggle to live, a decent home and warmth. We want colour in our lives, a better education for the kids, bigger pensions for the old people and all the rest. No doubt we're in a bit of a tough spot, and it'll take a year or two to get out. But we've done it before, and we can do it again.
And while the post-war situation is tumultuous for the common people, it's a windfall for the Allied militaries. Germany's defeat sees its treasure trove of technological secrets scatter for anyone looking to pick up the pieces. The Allied nations rush into German territory to recruit the top scientists and to integrate these advancements into their own country's technology. Russian forces lay their hands on the Reich Air Ministry in Berlin and the many secrets within it. Swept wings, rocket power, and the jet engine. With this information, they can make a vast leap ahead and finally begin to catch up to the Western powers. And since the pre-war days, when Stalin assessed his nation to be 50 to 100 years behind Western technology, the Soviet Union has been making great advancements. One Soviet manufacturer, the Mikoyan-Gurevich Design Bureau, has been creating aircraft since 1940, establishing a solid reputation for creating fighter planes. Their first post-war design, the MiG-9, is powered by a copy of the captured German BMW 003 engine. As early jets go, it has a fairly conventional design, an all-metal fuselage with straight wings. For their second-generation jet aircraft, they'll be incorporating some new ideas in aerodynamics. But for all the advancements that they'd like to implement, the power plant is not up to snuff. The German jet engine that the Russians discover has its flaws. The axial flow system, while powerful, is difficult to maintain. Engines quickly burn out and must be replaced. Their short lifespans plagued German ground crews throughout the war, and though the Soviets pursue the creation of their own jet engine based on this technology, they find themselves facing the very same problems the Germans had. Germany's most advanced jet engine design is proving difficult to perfect. The new airframe designs that Mikoyan-Gurevich are creating will need something more advanced and reliable than the adapted German engine. To keep up with Western development, Russia will need a centrifugal flow jet engine, like Frank Whittle has developed in England. While not as powerful as the axial engine, it's reliable and has been a proven performer. Rolls Royce has continued to make developments using Whittle's ideas, and currently have the Neen 2 engine, which, despite its great power, has only thus far been used in prototypes of the Hawker Seahawk and the failed Supermarine Attacker. Without an advanced jet engine, Russia's aircraft development will be at a standstill. The Soviet aviation minister Mikhail Khrushchev and designer Alexander Yakovlev suggest to Stalin that they purchase more advanced engines from another country. Stalin scoffs at Khrushchev's idea. What fool will sell us his secrets, he asks. Despite knowing that his men will fail on their journey to purchase this technology, Stalin allows the trade mission to go ahead. MiG's Artem Mikoyan, engine designer Vladimir Klimov and others travel to England to tour Rolls-Royce's plant and to see other British aircraft developments. When the trade mission lands in London, they find a socialist government ready to embrace them. There's still much goodwill afforded to Russia, still seen by British eyes as an ally in the noble war against Nazi forces. That, and post-war England needs money. The Soviet delegation tours the Rolls-Royce plant and are shown their latest engine developments, the Derwent and the Neen. They ask to purchase several of each. When the order comes across the desk of a Ministry of Supply employee, he warns Minister John Wilmot against selling the Soviets the technology. Britain is the absolute leader in jet engines. Russia is at least 5 years away from similar developments. Selling them one of the nation's greatest achievements would be, as Stalin has said, foolish. But the sale is pushed through by the President of the Board of Trade, Sir Stafford Cripps.
I think it was a socialist move to a socialist government, or an extreme Soviet government. We'd helped the Soviets before, or the Stalinists before, of course, at the beginning of World War II. But here I think this was going beyond the call of duty after the end of the war. And it certainly hurled them straight into the Premier League in aviation.
Despite a distrust of Stalin after his time in Moscow, Cripps sees the world breaking into two spheres of influence and wants to bring those sides together. Not only that, the sale means a good deal of money for Rolls-Royce at a time when big contracts are hard to come by. Cripps even offers to allow the Soviets to build the engine themselves under license.
The circumstances of the sale of the Rolls-Royce engines to Russia can't be divorced from Britain's economic predicament after the war, with a desperate need to increase exports. Cripps, as President of the Board of Trade, was the minister with primary responsibility for British trade. It's only natural, therefore, that he should have wanted to encourage expansion of British trade and opportunities for British exports in every direction possible. And certainly in 1946, he was taking the view that Russia was a promising export market as far as British manufacturers were concerned. I think it's only natural, given all the circumstances, that he would have wanted to approve the sale of aircraft engines, which, after all, at that time, were not regarded as classified or restricted, had not been put under any sort of military ban. And there's frankly no need to seek further for an ideological explanation of his decision to approve a deal that he saw simply as being in the British national interest in order to revive British trade.
While Cripps' actions on the sale may have been honest, the Soviet delegations are less so. Rather than accepting the license, the Russian engine manufacturer Klimov begins to reverse engineer the Nien from the examples they've purchased. The Russians begin producing a version, the Klimov RD-45. But creating a successful engine is proving difficult. England has a long history of metallurgy dating back centuries. Small forges all over the British Isles have developed techniques to create strong metals from ores and minerals found throughout the empire that are perfect at handling the high stresses and heat associated with the power of a jet engine. Russian metallurgy is not nearly as advanced, and they find this one of their main stumbling blocks in duplicating the engine. The Nien can run 500 hours between overhauls, but the Klimov copy doesn't last more than 100. They increase the size of the combustion chambers and turbine and refine the alloys used to create the engine. This new model is known as the Klimov VK1. With the engine ready, they can now finalize designs. In April of 1947, the Council of Ministers issue a decree ordering Mikoyan-Gurevich to build 2 prototypes of a new jet fighter, one that will put the Soviet Union ahead of the field in aircraft design. The Boeing B-29 has been America's frontline bomber since the final year of World War II. It's a revolutionary leap ahead of other aircraft, with its pressurized cabin and computer-assisted gun turrets. And now that the United States has the atomic bomb, the Soviet Union needs the future capabilities to defend against a bomber entering their territory with one of these tremendous weapons. The Council of Ministers wants an interceptor for just such a situation. Mikoyan-Gurevich looks back at their earlier aircraft to see any lessons they can learn. Their experimental canard plane, the MiG-8, had swept wings, a feature that they're interested in exploring further. Some captured German designs, like the TA-183 Huckebein, had swept wings implemented as well. Their latest jet, the MiG-9, has been promising, and they used this as the base to build from. Its engine troubles have been solved with the Klimov engine in place of the BMW power plant. It will also receive newly designed wings, swept back at an angle of 35 degrees. After some additional refinements, this new creation, the MiG-15, has a top speed of over 650 miles per hour. Though early production aircraft have a tendency to roll, these problems are lessened by adding aerodynamic trimmers near the ailerons and rudder. It's also recommended that pilots stay below Mach 0.9 to lessen any other stability problems. Test combat trials are conducted with a captured B-29 as well as the Soviet copy, the Tu-4. To shoot down the superfortress, the MiG-15 is armed with 2 23mm cannons and a single 37mm cannon. In 1949, production stops on the MiG-9 and the MiG-15 enters the Soviet Air Force. June the 25th, 1950. North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel into South Korean territory. By July the 5th, American forces have joined with the South Korean army. The United Nations also enters the fray under the guise of a police action. Soon, the conflict escalates beyond a ground war when the US calls for strategic bombing with its B-29s. In addition, piston-engine fighters like the Mustang and the Corsair, left over from the Second World War, are joined by the jet-powered Gloster Meteor and the F-80 Shooting Star. With the South Korean forces bolstered by UN support, North Korea also looks outside its borders for help. In October, Chairman Mao Zedong of China, fearing that a US occupation of the Korean peninsula would eventually lead to war with his country, sends a volunteer army into the fray. The North Korean and Chinese leaders ask Stalin for help, and while the Soviet dictator is unwilling to send in ground forces, he does provide aircraft in the form of the MiG-15 jet fighters, painted in Chinese colors to mask Soviet involvement. Soviet pilots are sent to train North Korean and Chinese airmen how to fly the fighter jets. They're taught simple Chinese phrases and dressed in Chinese uniforms and sent into the skies to combat and shoot down B-29s and engage the UN fighter forces. The piston-engine planes like the Mustang and the first-generation straight-winged jets are no match for the abilities of the MiG-15. It's faster, can fly higher and longer than any of its opponents. The Soviet victories come fast and often. The American pilots use their years of dogfighting experience to counter the superior technology at their enemy's disposal, but it's not always enough. Soon, B-29s are forced to limit their bombing runs to nighttime.
The first sighting of the MiG-15 in the Korean War, I think, had the same impact on pilots that as did the first sighting of the Focke-Wulf 190 just after the Battle of Britain, when it appeared in Europe. And we had nothing really to compare with it for the next year. Its success was due to two factors. One was the jet engine they had, the Nin, and the second one was, of course, the data they got from the captured German sources on the sweepback, wing sweepback. So it was a twin contribution, if you like.
Soviet air superiority begins to change in December of 1950, with the arrival of an all-new fighter aircraft for the American forces, the F-86 Sabre. First developed as the straight-winged FJ Fury jet, its design has changed to incorporate 35-degree swept-back wings and automatic slats. The Sabre is not a leap ahead of the Soviet jet, but it does level the playing field. The discovery of an advanced British engine in the fuselage of a Russian-designed plane infuriates the Americans. This is not the first time the Soviets have made a huge leap ahead in military technology. The August 1949 detonation of Russia's first atomic bomb showed just how far they could advance technologically in a few years, with some outside help. First, Klaus Fuchs, a German-born scientist brought in by England to work on the Manhattan Project, has been arrested for providing the Soviet Union with atomic bomb designs. And at the moment, Donald Maclean, a high-ranking British Foreign Ministry official, is suspected by the FBI of providing the Soviets with a variety of information. As the British representative on the American, Canadian and British Atomic Secrets Council during the war, he's had access to nuclear secrets at a time when the quest for the bomb was known only to a few. It's in the autumn that UN forces finally get their hands on the MiG-15 and discover the secret of its power plant. It's confirmed when two men are dropped behind enemy lines to a crashed MiG-15, dug into the ground. No chance to remove the entire wreck, they use grenades to separate the engine. The Americans are livid. How could England have handed over a piece of powerful technology to Stalin's regime? But they have little time to blame Sir Stafford Cripps for selling the engines to their enemies. He's been retired for close to a year due to failing health. In October, Winston Churchill's Conservatives edge out the Labour Party, knocking Attlee out of government. Churchill, as Prime Minister once more, makes Anglo-American relations a priority again. And with him back in power, there's little chance that the Soviets will find any socialists to sell them other technology. In the northwest of Korea, in an area along the Yalu River, the first large-scale jet versus jet air battles of history take place, in an area dubbed MiG Alley. When the Sabres reach MiG Alley, they have only 20 minutes of fuel to engage the enemy with. The MiG-15s, with their bases nearby, can linger much longer. American pilots charge in at 40,000 feet, only to find the MiG-15s flying 10,000 feet above them. The MiGs hide in the sun's glare, then swoop in as a formation of Sabres are on patrol. The Russian fighter does have its share of weaknesses. The cannons it's equipped with, while powerful, have a low rate of fire compared to the Sabre's guns. It also has poor stalling characteristics. A Sabre pilot can force a MiG-15 into a dive that becomes a spin that cannot be recovered from. The combat experience of the United Nations pilots ultimately trumps the sophistication of the Soviet plane. By war's end, the UN forces have shot down 900 enemy aircraft, almost 800 of which are MiG-15s. But the aircraft has proven that the Soviets can use a blend of ingenuity and craftiness to match the West's innovation. Between the USSR, Czechoslovakia, Poland and China, over 16,000 MiG-15s are produced. In 1958, Rolls Royce Deputy Chairman Whitney Straight is touring a factory in China when he sees an engine curiously similar to the Neen. Discovering that its origins lie in the reverse engineering of the Neen, he attempts to collect payment for the almost 50,000 engines that Klimov made by taking and adapting the design and licensing it to other countries for the MiG-15 and later aircraft. £200 million is the compensation he's looking for. He leaves without one farthing. The man whose decision led to the jet engine being copied is long since gone. Sir Stafford Cripps dies in April of 1952 in the midst of the Korean War. And while he's remembered mainly for his contributions to Britain's war effort and the post-war cultural shift, he will forever be tied to the MiG-15 by that one decision.
Cripps has always been, to a large extent, the prisoner of his own reputation, but it was a reputation that shifted over time. In the 1930s, his own high principles led him to take a very extreme political position on the far left of the political spectrum, arguing that only full-blooded socialism or even communism could offer an answer to the economic problems of the day. By the 1940s, Cripps's position is quite different from what it had been 10 years previously. It took people, quite naturally, some time to catch up with the rather rapid evolution through which he'd gone.
An evolution which is often overshadowed in aviation circles by this gift to Russia. A decision that may have been motivated by all the right reasons, but strengthens the might of the Soviet military for years to come.
On December 17th, 1950, while patrolling Korean airspace, a United States Air Force F-86 Sabre spotted the distinct silhouette of a Model 15 MiG below. The Sabre's pilot descended rapidly towards the target and maneuvered behind the Soviet-built aircraft. The MiG swerved to evade the American pilot's sights, momentarily appearing as if it were the Predator. However, it took only a few minutes for the American pilot to position himself for the shot, and within seconds, the struggle for air superiority over Korea, with the prestige of two opposing philosophies at stake, had begun. The history of jet-powered fighters actually dates back to before the Second World War. The first Allied jet fighter to enter service was the British Gloucester Meteor. Utilising two centrifugal flow engines, the Meteor increased fighter speeds from the previous maximum of 400 miles per hour to around 500 miles per hour. These Meteors were stationed in Europe just before the end of the Second World War. They garnered significant interest from American airmen, as the United States Air Force didn't have an equivalent jet fighter in service at that time. In fact, the Meteor saw very little combat, primarily being kept in England to prevent the new technology from falling into enemy hands. However, it proved vitally useful for shooting down the V-1 weapons fired against Britain, a role where its high speed was a significant advantage. The British fear of the Meteor falling into German hands was somewhat paradoxical, as Germany was at least a year ahead in jet design and had flown jet-powered aircraft before the war. Here, a young German pilot received some last-minute advice before his first jet flight. Undoubtedly, the Luftwaffe's most impressive success was the Messerschmitt 262. This excellent aircraft, powered by two axial flow jet engines, was actually faster than the Meteor. Additionally, it featured a successful aerodynamic shape, and later models were designed to utilize a swept wing philosophy that German engineers were developing at the time. Over 1,500 Messerschmitt 262s were built, but on Hitler's insistence, many were designated for a bomber role, a function for which the Swallow, as it was known, was not ideally suited. Eventually, and initially unofficially, the German High Command permitted the 262 to be used as a fighter. In the short time it served in this capacity, the 262's remarkable speed wreaked havoc among Allied bombers. Unfortunately for the Germans, the 262 came just too late to save the Third Reich, but it did give the Allies another insight as to the possibilities of jet development. Focusing more on improving piston engine design, America didn't begin developing jet technology until 1942. Had the war continued, the excellent Lockheed Shooting Star would have been its first combat jet. This is a photo reconnaissance version, but the basic fighter, which saw service for many years, was essentially the same. The Republic Thunderjet offered further improvements, with a slender, streamlined fuselage and more powerful jet engines. However, both the P-80 and the P-84 used a straight wing design that wasn't significantly different from the shapes employed during World War II. The North American Aviation Company initially adopted a conventional straight-wing layout for its first jet. However, they gained access to data on German swept-wing technology immediately after the war, leading them to modify the wing and tailplane positions into a swept-back format. The P-86 Sabre, as it became known, ultimately incorporated many other advanced features, such as the all-moving tailplane, automatic slats on the wing, and powered air brakes. Most importantly, its swept surfaces reduced air resistance, allowing for higher speeds. At the heart of the P-86 was a General Electric J-47 jet engine, which utilized the axial flow principle, similar to that used in the earlier German Me-262, but now more sophisticated and refined. The jet concept operated on the principle of air being drawn in through the nose intake of the aircraft, then passing into an axial flow compressor area where the air is progressively compressed through 12 different stages. It's then forced into the combustion chambers where atomized fuel is injected and ignited. The resulting combustion and expansion of exhaust gases provide the necessary thrust and also drive the compressor, allowing the cycle to continue. The thrust produced by this jet engine technology was something that ground crew also had to adapt to. No-go areas were declared in front of the engine intake to prevent personnel from being sucked in, and behind the jet because of the phenomenal blast. One problem all jet engines had compared to piston aircraft was their vast fuel consumption. In the confined space of a fighter's fuselage, every square inch of available space was dedicated to fuel storage. The Sabre, like many other fighters, also employed drop tanks to provide extra kerosene. Most Sabres that went into production were equipped with 6 50mm machine guns as standard armament, mounted on each side of the heavily armoured pilot's position. Mainly due to the advantages of the swept wing at high speed, the Sabre went into production on October 16, 1947, with an initial order of 33 F-86A and 190 F-86B aircraft, which were later reclassified as F-86As. From the moment a pilot pushed the external switch to operate the powered canopy, they were stepping into a new world. Once inside, the pilot would first check the ejector seat locking pins, which couldn't be removed until shortly before taxiing to prevent accidental firing while the plane was still on the ground. They would then take stock of the staggering array of controls and instrumentation integral to the new technology. Managing a Sabre was far more complex than the stick and rudder techniques required of earlier planes. Here, 5,200 pounds of thrust had to be controlled and directed to propel what was at the time the world's fastest fighter.
George Tower Tower, this is Air Force 184 requesting taxi clearance. Over.
Air Force 184, this is George Tower. Traffic southwest, cleared to runway 21 right.
One difference between jet-powered and piston engines is that jet engines take some time to build up the necessary thrust to get the aircraft off the ground. This was particularly true for heavier jet bombers, but even fighters needed to build up thrust before takeoff. If you look carefully at this shot, you can see the automatic leading edge flaps open, providing the pilot with more control at low speeds. In every respect, the Sabre was an aircraft for fighter pilots, and its nimbleness and agility were to prove invaluable in the years to come. During this period, the Air Force replaced the designation P for pursuit with the more fitting F for fighter, renaming the Sabre the F-86. Throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, the Air Force showcased the Sabre's performance in numerous public displays. These demonstrations often featured up to 80 aircraft flying in intricate formations, showcasing their aerial skills. The breaking of the sound barrier was still a novelty, and although by then it was a routine for the pilots, at these airshows it was a highlight of the day for the crowds. Public confidence in American air power became crucial in 1949 when the Soviets demonstrated a formidable capability. They had replicated the American B-29 long-range bombers, capable of reaching the US on one-way missions. Moreover, they successfully detonated an atomic bomb, ending America's nuclear monopoly. This, alongside deteriorating US-Soviet relations, sparked significant concern. To counter potential Russian threats, production of the Sabre was ramped up, and an all-weather variant was developed, the F-86D Sabre Dog. This aircraft featured a sophisticated radar scanner mounted over the nose to detect enemy bombers in all-weather conditions, including at night. It also carried a rack of unguided rockets in the fuselage, deemed more effective for engaging attacking Russian bombers. When conflict erupted, it unfolded in a distant land. North Korean troops invaded South Korea, prompting the United Nations to intervene, and US B-29s were swiftly deployed to the region to target northern factories and communications. Despite not being ideally suited for this role, the B-29s effectively carried out their missions, securing US dominance of the skies over Korea. However, on November 1, 1950, American pilots were surprised to encounter the first Russian-built MiG-15s. These aircraft represented a significant technological leap beyond what the Soviets were previously believed to possess. Even with their defensive armament, B-29s stood little chance against these advanced Soviet fighters. In response to this new threat, the Pentagon ordered F-86s to be deployed to Korea, marking the beginning of the intense MiG versus Sabre aerial combat.
The first 4 flights into the area will stay below the contrails and keep a close watch on the fighter bombers. The last 2 flights will go above the contrails and check very closely for any MiG aircraft that might come in above the cons. Now, if you see MiGs up there today, call them out. Give their altitude, direction, and geographical location on the map. And call it out and then get off the radio. Now remember, once you look around, keep your speed up, and if you do get a bounce, cut him off, and drive in range. When you get in range, shoot, and when you shoot, shoot to kill. Anybody got any questions? Okay, let's go again.
Typically, Sabre forces operated in groups of 4 aircraft.
Tiger lead, Tiger 2 here. I got a couple bogeys out there with 1 coming around at 2 level. Roger, boy, I got up.
By 1952, American pilots had engaged MiG-15s in numerous successful sorties. Similar to the dynamics of the Second World War, a group of elite aces emerged, men who demonstrated exceptional skill and determination in combat with their fighters. One of these American aces was Colonel Gabreski. Gabreski arrived in Korea already decorated as an ace, having flown Thunderbolts during World War II, but he further cemented his reputation as a MiG killer. The skill and experience of American pilots were crucial, considering that the MiG-15 itself was a formidable aircraft. While MiG kills outnumbered Sabre losses, the MiG-15 was undeniably a brilliant aircraft and, in several aspects, superior to the Sabre. Due to the MiG-15's impressive performance, the Air Force was eager to acquire one to study its design and capabilities, and in the later stages of the conflict, dropped leaflets over enemy territory offering enemy pilots $100,000 if they defected with their plane to the south. One pilot, Lieutenant Rowe, accepted the offer, and it must have been a surprising sight for the ground crew at Kimpo on September 21, 1953, when a MiG-15 landed. The aircraft was soon in the hands of American pilots, eager to fly and evaluate the MiG for themselves. One of the standout features of the MiG-15 was its armament, a combination of one 37mm and two 23mm cannon mounted in a compact, removable unit. This setup allowed for quick replacement by ground crew, enabling rapid turnaround times for the aircraft. The borrowed MiG, equipped with ammunition, provided an opportunity to test its firepower. Aircraft equipped with heavy cannon typically have a slower rate of fire compared to the 6 machine guns on the Sabre, but they deliver significantly greater hitting power. The MiG's armament prompted the US to develop a configuration for the Sabre, featuring 4 20mm cannon, replacing the original 6 50mm machine guns. Despite arriving late in the Korean conflict, the cannon-equipped Sabre achieved several MiG kills. However, for most of the campaign, it was the Sabre's machine guns, known for their high rate of fire, that brought down the majority of the MiGs. Pilots were trained to approach the enemy not directly from behind, but slightly from the side, as this angle presented a larger fuselage surface to target. Despite the Sabre's superior design and firepower, the F-86s faced formidable challenges. Nevertheless, the original Sabre design's excellence and its robust airframe proved crucial. Many aircraft returned home with significant damage, yet were still airworthy, a testament to the Sabre's durability and the skill of its pilots. The Sabre's heavy armor for pilots played a crucial role in saving many lives during the Korean conflict. As the Korean conflict progressed, American aces were redeployed to train new pilots in combat techniques specific to the F-86. This approach, where experienced pilots passed on their skills to younger aviators, was a pivotal part of the American strategy that ultimately prevailed in the Korean air conflict. Given the MiG-15's comparable overall capability to the Sabre, the skill of the pilots was often the deciding factor in engagements. Had the MiG been in the hands of better trained pilots, the outcome of the conflict might have been very different. It was the greater competence and better training of the American pilots with their consequent greater skill that was the real margin between the two planes. Preparing for flight was a complex and weighty process for the pilot. They would have to don a heavy flight suit along with a lined vest and carry the obligatory .45 automatic. Additionally, they had to don a Mae West life preserver, an essential parachute, and a survival kit containing various items from a rubber raft to a homing beacon. By the time they settled into the Sabre cockpit, complete with helmet and oxygen mask, they likely felt deeply integrated with the aircraft. This connection between pilot and machine was not just symbolic, but also essential to the effectiveness of US fighters during the Korean campaign. The Sabre's design allowed for significant versatility in its role. Originally an interceptor, it could also be configured to carry air-to-ground rockets or bombs when necessary. The Sabre's design versatility made it well suited for roles beyond interception. Although it was seldom used in interdiction missions during the Korean War, other countries in different theatres employed the F-86 very effectively as a ground attack aircraft. In the mid-1950s, just after the Korean conflict, the US developed air-to-air homing missiles like the innovative Sidewinder. These missiles were integrated onto Sabres to enhance their interception capabilities. In this scenario, a standard 5-inch unguided rocket is fired from one side of an F-86 to serve as a test target for the Sidewinder missile fired from the other side. The Sabre's production extended beyond the United States, with manufacturing in Canada and Australia and assembly in Italy and Japan. However, one of the most intriguing developments occurred in Australia. The Royal Australian Air Force sought an enhanced version of the Sabre, leading to a comprehensive redesign by the Commonwealth Aircraft Factory. They strengthened and lengthened the fuselage to accommodate the Avon engine, also used in their Canberra bombers. This engine provided 50% more thrust than the early Sabre engines, although integrating it posed significant challenges. The Australian Sabre emerged as the most powerful variant produced. While its maximum speed wasn't significantly higher than the American version, it boasted superior acceleration and lifting capabilities. The large letter P on the side of this plane is the standard Commonwealth symbol for prototype, similar to the Y used by American aircraft. Australia produced 112 Avon-powered Sabres, some of which were transferred to the Indonesian Air Force as they were replaced by the French Mirage. By the early 1960s, the Sabre, still in service with many nations, was beginning to show its age. While the addition of Sidewinder missiles bolstered its effectiveness as an interceptor, no aircraft, even the renowned F-86, could remain in the front line indefinitely. Moreover, North American aviation had introduced a successor in the form of the F-100 Super Sabre. Larger and capable of speeds up to 1,000 miles per hour, the F-100 Super Sabre marked the beginning of the famed Century series of American fighter aircraft. In the early 1960s, the Sabres were gradually phased out and reassigned to roles within the Home Guard. Here, a pilot inspects an F-86 Sabre that has been relegated to Home Guard duties. Once again, the synergy between pilot and aircraft proves to be highly effective, even in this new capacity. The skills and experience of a combat veteran are invaluable to the nation, and so is the enduring value of the investment in a well-built and long-serving aircraft like the F-86 Sabre. Even after its retirement from frontline service, the Sabre continued to serve a vital role in the hands of skilled and dedicated aircrew within the Home Guard, providing a robust second line of defense. In the United States, the F-86 remained operational with National Guard squadrons well into the 1970s, and it continues to be flown by air forces in various countries around the world. The design, originating in the 1940s, has proven exceptionally durable, not only because of the Sabre's solid construction, but also because it consistently fulfilled its mission requirements.
All all of these accidents occurred within U.S.A. There are minor accidents and major accidents. Some leave the aircraft in one piece, some in pieces. Others just leave a hole in the ground. You can have accidents in any kind of aircraft. Almost $17 million. That was the cost of major aircraft accidents in U.S.A. alone during a single year. That $17 million represents only the cost of the aircraft after deducting depreciation and does not include the bills for personal injuries and property damage. Lives? Who can calculate them in dollars? More than 58% of all aircraft accidents in U.S.A. are attributed to pilot error. The truth is that you, the pilot, can create or fail to prevent a situation that can cost your life. Flying safety records indicate that the fellows who wind up on the Forms 14 are not always the victims of a single drastic mistake. More often than not, the cause is an accumulation of seemingly minor errors. Most of you pilots are good at your jobs. You've had the best training. You've got good equipment. But it's the little things that catch you. Just like they almost caught this pilot. Like a lot of other pilots, he thought that flying safety was personal, just between him and his plane. He slept through flying safety talks, or he let his mind drift. But he was converted. He became a believer, but fast.
Yeah, I buy it now, but my Frau almost collected on that fat insurance policy before I saw the light. It happened on one of those routine boondoggles. Yesterday I flew down here to Alpha from Bravo Air Base and RON.
Hey, Pop, Mommy.
Should have left here a few hours ago, but I was partying last night and... Yeah, you know how that goes. A little oxygen will knock this in the head.
Don't kid me, that was you at the wall.
Oh, no, it wasn't, boy.
Morning, sir.
You got a clearance form?
Going on a jet flight?
Yeah.
Here you are.
Thanks a lot.
Want a local map?
Well, okay. Paperwork. Reams of it. 16 copies to the devil himself, with an info copy to every head shrinker in the puzzle palace. All this junk for a simple little flight. There's no sweat on this one. I can do it standing on my head. Well, like they say, you can't fight City Hall. Frequencies. Yeah, I know what Bravo Beacon is. Well, now to get my weather. Yeah, I better check the NOTAMs first. Boy. I just left Bravo yesterday. Nothing could have changed in that time. Now, let's see. Everything seems to be okay here. Cold front moving down.
Hi there. May I help you, sir?
No, thanks. I've been checking on weather for years.
Well, okay.
That's all I'd need. A lecture on climatology. Now, Bravo is still VFR. I'm okay. Well, old dog's in good shape. Everything checks out okay. I have a full service job, except for the oxygen supply, but that's just what I asked for. I'll have enough for this hop even after I take care of that hangover. Gotta report that lousy cabin pressure seal. Thanks. Yeah, plenty of fuel, full internal load, and 50 gallons in each drop. The contest is ready to start. Off of that hangover. This ought to knock the edge off it. I'll let it ride at 100% while I tax it.
One-9 Alpha, clear for takeoff, winds 260 degrees at 14, over.
Roger, rolling.
One-9 Alpha, airborne at 16, clear tower, frequency over.
Roger, tower, out.
Yeah, this is great. Feel a lot better now. Hangover's gone. Everything's in the green. Altitude Angels 30, heading 030. Everything's right on the money. Approaching the control zone now. Looks like a little weather up ahead. Better give a position check to ground control.
Railroad, this is Air Force Jet 24129.
Air Force 24129 here, this is Railroad.
Over Buckshot at 1215-30,000. Victor Fox Alpha to Bravo. Estimating Bravo at 40 past the hour.
Roger, 129, out.
Yeah, what's wrong with me? Must be that hangover again. Toot, forgot the blasted oxygen. I gotta get this frapping thing off. Get on in a hurry. It's better. Nice, thick air. What a stupid move. Should have remembered to turn off that 100%. Oh, well, it's over. I'm okay now. Gotta watch that fuel, though. This can is really gulping it down at this altitude. I better tune in the bird dog about now. Now, let's see. Bravo beacon is 327. Whoops. Can't take much of that. Hangover's back. Now, that's better. You must be off a little. Wonder why I had to make a right drift correction. Must be a pretty strong crosswind. I better get a steer. A practice steer, that's all I need.
Bravo DF from 24129. Request practice steer to base.
Roger, 24129. Steer to base with 0 winds at 090 degrees.
090. Well, there must be some mistake. I have your beacon right on the nose, and you give me a steer of 090.
Request you check that steer.
Roger, 129er. Transmit for another steer. Roger, 129er. We have a class Alpha steer. Your last transmission indicates. So your steer is 092 degrees magnetic. Over.
But how can that be? I'm bird dog right on the money at 327 KCs. Must have made a mistake.
0129. For your information, Bravo beacon has been changed from 327 KCs to 205 KCs. The notification of this change was distributed yesterday to all bases in a NOTAM. You must have 326 KCs. The frequency from Medora Beacon, 60 miles northwest of Bravo.
NOTAMs. Roger, Bravo Control.
0129, your last transmission indicates your steer is now 095.
By the way, what's your current weather?
0129, the latest sequence time, 1200 Zebra. Bravo Air Base, 200 feet, 4/10. Light rain, wind 070 degrees at 4 knots. Altimeter 29907.
Roger. The weather sure pitched me a curve. They had the front 50 miles north of Bravo. Unless I was looking at an old weather map, I should have read the sequences. Wouldn't have taken long.
Bravo Tower from 129. What are the GCA minimums for your base?
0129, GCA minimums for Bravo are 301 mile.
Well, I can't hack that. It's below minimums. What's the nearest alternate?
0129, closest alternate is Coco Air Base. Their last report was 4,000 broken at 5 miles.
Roger, we'll proceed to Coco. Will you make a check on the current weather there? That's about 40 miles from my present position. I don't have much fuel left.
Roger, 129er.
Things are beginning to pile up on me. First the oxygen runs out, and then Bravo's socked in. Now it'll be tight on fuel to Coco. I sure bought myself a lot of trouble. If I just had some oxygen, I could have stayed at altitude and cut down my fuel consumption.
Air Force 129, this is Bravo Tower.
Go ahead, Bravo.
Coco reports weather unchanged. 4,000 broken at 5 miles.
Roger. I better get under this cotton-picking stuff while I can. There's Coco.
Coco Tower from Air Force 24129er.
And PFR have field in sight. Request landing instructions. I have 450 pounds.
Roger, 129, land runway 26, call on the break.
Roger.
Tower is 129, going around. Can't get my gear down.
Roger, 129, check on the brake again.
Come on, you. Lick with the wheels.
Tower, looks like I have 1 down and 2 up.
We have the glasses on you. Your main gear still appears to be up.
push to 138.6 for GCA.
Crash, we have an 86, number 24129er in the pattern. He's at minimum fuel and can't get his gear down. Landing on 126.
I'm gonna fall down if I don't get this can in soon. It's gonna be close.
129, this is Caravan. Try your emergency gear system.
I already tried it.
Did you pull it full out?
Tower, gear down, final.
Well, no business today. He made it.
129er, clear for a right turn off, taxi to hard stand south side.
Well, that contest is over.
Tower, this 129. I'm flamed out. Request a tow.
Roger.
Let's go, boy. We gotta pick up a cold one. Now, some of you may be thinking that this pilot should have augured in. Some of you may be saying, well, this is a motion picture. These things just don't happen in real life. Things like excessive drinking, lack of sleep before a flight, failure to check the NOTAMs, not knowing that the frequency of the destination had been changed, miscalculation of the weather, not listening to the weather officer, and not checking the sequences, not remembering to conserve the oxygen supply when there's a faulty cabin pressure seal, improper operation of the emergency gear system. Yes, you're right. This pilot probably would have clobbered. But you're wrong if you think these mistakes just don't happen. They have happened, time and time again. And when errors of this nature pile up on you, they comprise a lethal weapon. Through the magic of the motion picture, this pilot survived. But how about you? In your flying, do you depend upon magic, luck, or safe flying?
In January 1963, the Air Force initiated tactical weapons effects tests on realistic limited war targets. The high-performance aircraft were typical of those assigned to tactical strike forces. Forces which are ready to act immediately in potential limited war situations. During the weapons effects test, they attacked difficult air and ground targets flying at high speed to ensure their survival over well-defended battle areas. More than 20 target complexes were chosen or constructed to simulate the range of ground targets likely to be encountered in limited war anywhere in the world. Included was a simulated anti-aircraft missile site, patterned after those of Soviet design that were photographed in Cuba. Part of the test criteria was high-speed reconnaissance location of individual targets. Delivery time of developed negatives and blow-up prints for photo interpretation was comparable to operational pre-strike missions. Prints were delivered to simulated Air Force Army command elements in between 1 hour and 40 minutes and 2 hours. Test missions against aircraft and air support targets began early in January. First test for the F-105 Thunderchief and its high-speed 20mm Gatling gun was made against a radio-controlled jet fighter. High explosive and armor-piercing incendiaries destroyed the fighter. The F-100 Super Sabre was tested against a low-speed air target at 800 feet altitude. The attack aircraft destroyed a 13-foot radio-controlled simulated light plane flying at 180 miles an hour. With the jet fighter target, maximum range low-altitude tests of the Sidewinder missile were performed by the F-104 Starfighter. Evaluation of the Thunderchief as a high-speed napalm delivery vehicle was made against parked jet aircraft at a simulated forward area field. Test for strafing damage against parked jet aircraft was made with the F-104's Gatling gun. The F-105 was used to evaluate the high-velocity 5-inch Sunni rocket against typical airstrip targets. Napalm was tested for the first time against missile site-type guidance control vans, F-100s, in low-level, high-speed attack. Against the simulated anti-aircraft missiles, Super Sabres tested the effectiveness of 20mm high-explosive incendiaries. .75-inch rockets with high-explosive heads were tested against a maintenance tent area, fired from a Super Sabre. The rocket's dispersal pattern provided lethal shrapnel damage and fire throughout work areas. A larger tent area where supplies would be stored in field conditions was attacked with napalm. High-speed F-84F Thunderstreaks accomplished this evaluation. High speed was an important criteria in the tests to assure aircraft survivability over presumably well-defended targets. A test for pilot skill and guidance accuracy with the bullpup missile was conducted from a Super Sabre. Target was a concrete bunker. The instantaneous fused missile was launched at a slant range of 3.6 miles. The 250-pound warhead exploded on contact 25 feet from the aiming point. Results indicated that delayed action fusing is more effective for this type target. A command post bunker with 3-foot concrete walls was used to evaluate the Zuni rocket. F-100s were loaded with 8 Zunis equipped with penetrating heads. Direct hits were scored at slant ranges of 3,700 to 4,000 feet. In the next scene, a flat-nosed bomb with a delayed fuse bounces off a wall as an F-105 makes a follow-up attack on the command post. This test was successful. Earlier test runs with too shallow an angle of attack caused the bombs to skip over the target. Close-in ground support attacks on mortar positions were initiated by the F-104. 2.75 high-explosive rockets. Coverage was good. Damage included shrapnel hits on all test mannequins. Follow-up tests on other mortars used 2 F-84s releasing 3,000 pounds of napalm. Starfighters with 2.75 rockets made attacks on an artillery piece. Mixed loads were carried by 3 aircraft. Half high-explosive heads, half high-explosive anti-tank heads. One of the rockets knocked out the 90-millimeter gun. Other hits were lethal for gun crews. A typical fuel dump was the test target for Gatling gun incendiaries fired by F-104s. Firing altitude was 800 feet. Bombing capability of the Thunder Chief was evaluated against large area targets. The weapons load was 16 750-pound bombs for each airplane. A typical military convoy group was the target for effects testing of the F-105's Gatling gun. The effectiveness of high-performance aircraft against a low-flying helicopter was tested using a radio-controlled H-43A as a target. Attack speed was 460 miles per hour. One burst of 20-millimeter incendiaries from the F-105 the helicopter. The target to test the kill capability of the Bullpup missile was a heavily armored tank. Bullpup was launched by an F-100 from a distance of 2.5 miles. The tank was knocked out by a direct hit that pierced the top of the turret. The hatch cover and other parts were found up to 200 feet away from the burning tank. The effectiveness test of napalm against convoy targets was carried out by 4 starfighters. Delivery was low and fast. The drop was a split-second length. Destruction was limited to the forward part of the convoy. A jungle-style target used in the test was this 4-section pontoon bridge designed to support 2.5-ton trucks. A B-26 of the type used in areas like Vietnam made the attack with 2.75 rockets. F-104s conducted an effectiveness test of napalm against tank targets. Test equipment inside one of the tanks showed severe heat damage. The effect of 2.75 rockets on a 105mm howitzer comprised the next test. Launching aircraft was the F-100D. Coming up next, a target-mounted camera shows the rocket pattern. The weapon and its self-propelled vehicle were crippled by the attack. A varied array of landing craft in anchored and beached positions were the test targets for combined attacks by fighters. Closely resembling combat tactics because of the number of aircraft involved, this series of attacks employed 20mm cannon, as well as Zuni and 2.75 rockets. Target area was particularly well adapted for recording the pattern spread of rocket attacks. The barges were aground in shallow water, permitting extensive documentation of all types of damage. Operating with weapons of great destructive power is inherently dangerous. A case in point was this rail cut mission. Armament was 4 flat-nosed bombs with delay fuses. The 14-second delay allows the plane to clear the target before the bombs explode. The attacking F-105 was accompanied by an F-100F chase aircraft. One bomb exploded instantaneously. Fragments hit both aircraft. A tracking mount on the ground picked up the chase aircraft, the more critically damaged of the two. Both men aboard the plane ejected successfully. Several miles away, the F-105 pilot also had to bail out. His controls locked and his aircraft shedding pieces. All men survived with minor injuries. A test attack against immobile train targets was carried out by F-100s and F-104s. The first weapon was the bullpup guided missile. .75 rockets with high explosive anti-tank head. A strafing attack with armor-piercing and high explosive incendiaries. Concurrent with weapons effects tests, the Air Force conducted tactical evaluations of its troop and cargo carriers. The YC-123H, grossing out at 62,000 pounds, landed 100 feet short and stopped in just over 950 feet. In addition to conventional engines, the 123H has two jet engines to shorten takeoff distance. Computed payload for the test was 20,000 pounds. This experimental aircraft has a beefed-up and widened landing gear. Unloaded, the 123H was able to take off in 750 feet. Tests were conducted with an unfavorable 15-knot quartering tailwind. The technique of heavy cargo extraction was tested with the long-range C-130B Hercules. The aircraft does not land. Cargo, a 5,900-pound weapons carrier. Short field assault capability of the C-130B was tested on a soft clay strip. Grossing 119,000 pounds, the aircraft stopped in 1,050 feet. Touchdown was at the 100-foot mark, and stop was at the 1,150-foot mark. Taking off at the same weight, the C-130 used the additional thrust of 8 rocket motors to break ground in 650 feet. Range of the C-130 with a typical load of 64 fully equipped airborne troops is 3,600 statute miles. Further tests showed that after unloading, the aircraft could take off within 500 feet. As in combat, not all attacks were successful. There were misses as well as hits, and some weapon malfunctions. The test revealed areas where additional research and development is required to improve certain weapons and develop new capabilities. Invaluable training was accorded all test personnel, and the main purpose of the test was successfully accomplished. Data was gathered on the effects of specific weapons striking specific targets, all leading to increased tactical air combat capability. Here in review are some of the highlights of the test documentation. Guns. Rockets. Flat-nose bombs. 750s. Missiles. Napalm.
Aviation The art of aeronautics began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's skunkworks Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the DroneScapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.